finally have started to get a little bit of cold weather, I think we can really dive into our discussions on polar regions. And we heard last week from Professor Zanowski, and this week we're going to hear from our other new start at AOS, as well as a new addition to our CCR family, Professor Till Wagner, who will be talking about his work on Arctic amplification and sea ice loss. Till joined our department just a few months ago, and his work works on ice-ocean atmosphere interactions, brought in on this emerging polar regions cluster. We have several faculty across AOS, geoscience, and forest and wildlife ecology in. Also works on glacier, iceberg, and sea ice mechanics, and according to your CV, a thing I don't know what it means, but nonlinear mechanics, elasticity, and elastomopapillarity. So you may have to enlighten us in the atmospheric science world at least, what that is all about. But let's see, you got your PhD in mathematics from the University of Cambridge, as well as a master's in physics and philosophy at the University of Bristol. So, very curious. We have to pick your brain about the philosophy side too. Prior to joining UW-Madison, he was at Scripps in oceanography as a postdoc, and then also as a faculty at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington in physics and physical oceanography. And it's been wonderful to have him join us today, and hopefully we'll learn a bunch more about your work. So with that, I'll turn it over, and thank you.
Okay, just quickly, I hope you can hear me in the back. I did put on the mic, so I hope that works. Thank you, Anchor, and thank you to CCR and CPEP for the invitation. I'm excited to talk to you about some of our work today. And before I start, I want to credit my collaborators, in particular Mark England, who was a postdoc with me at UNC Wilmington, and was co-advised with Ian Eisenman at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I also want to acknowledge Nick Lutzko, who was a collaborator on some of this. Yeah, so this is really a lot of Mark's sort of core contribution, which I think is really fascinating, and I'm very excited to talk to you about this. So just quickly, to give you an idea, well, you probably all know Arctic amplification refers to the idea that temperature change in the Arctic is typically amplified relative to the rest of the globe. And what you see here is output from the CPEP model ensemble, the response of surface temperatures to an abrupt fourfold increase in CO2. This sort of change is robust, also seen in standard RCP 8.5 climate model warming simulations, and nothing much has changed between the last IPCC assessment report 5 and AR6. This seems to be a very robust sort of general signal. Here is the latest. This is very recently published, so you can see it's all still grainy because I had to screenshot it from the not final typeset version. Similar to this plot, this is PMEP and reconstruction results. So you can see that Arctic amplification takes place in all sorts of past climates as well. And if you pay close attention to the way these are written, you'll find that here in the LGM run, they've switched the order. So this is actually Arctic amplified cooling relative to the other two. I think they should have not switched it and just have it darker blue up there, just this way. It took me a minute to get my senses here. In the observations, this is also borne out. So this is the Headcrad observational data set for the last 40 years, and you can see pretty extreme warming relative the rest of the globe. Now, the story I'm going to tell you here is about the observational record over the last 100 years. And that's something that people haven't really looked into, or at least not published on. And I'm going to use just basically all the data sets that we have available, more or less, not all, but a bunch. There's some reanalysis products as well as more straight up observational products. And the fascinating, we talk about head crowd as having 200 member ensemble in an observational data set. It's really just a fancy way of doing uncertainty estimation in the observations. It's not to measure internal variability, what you would usually think of when you talk about ensembles. So here is GISTEMP data, and there is this curiosity that this is a 50-year trend, and this is the Arctic temperature time series over the last 100 years. And you can actually see that there's a very distinct Arctic cooling effect while having global warming over the same time period. And since we're always thinking about Arctic amplification sort of being a robust signal throughout, we were curious as to what was going on there. And I have to give full credit to Mark here. He was the one who spotted this. And this is robust in all the data sets that we considered. And so if we now consider all the 50-year trends, starting from the so I'm plotting the midterm of a 50-year trend on the horizontal axis, and the mid-year on the horizontal axis and the trend on the vertical, right? And so if I do this little animation, then you realize that the Arctic, here shown in blue, was actually cooling for all these trends up to the one in, I think, 1968. The Arctic was cooling, and then we only started ramping up in the Arctic, and then it quickly overtook the global warming signal. So, whereas the globe overall has been, the 50-year trends for the whole globe have been increasing throughout. So you only really have Arctic amplification in the past 100 years emerge from 1975 or so on. So, how robust is that? Well, we can get a bit of an idea, for example, by looking at the 200 ensemble members from Hadcrat, which gives you this uncertainty estimation. And so it seems to be a pretty robust observation signal in the observations. Now, how about the models? Well, let's look at CESM. This is the classic CESM for all forcing runs. And you can see you can find members, here the ones with the plus, that fits the observations really well. But then you also get some members, this one here, member number 31, that has Arctic amplification throughout. So if the nice thing with these large ensembles that you have, for example, for CESM, right, you can look at all 40 members and you see that it's broadly borne out in the CSM simulations as well. Not as striking as in the observations, but not too bad. Sorry, if you have any questions also regarding the climate simulations or what I mean by large ensemble, so please let me know. Yeah, a large ensemble is exactly the same run over and over, just with a tiny perturbation at the beginning of your historical simulation. So they are designed to sort of measure the internal variability of the system. Now, the nice thing about CESM is that there are published data of single forcing runs, ones where you have the industrial aerosols fixed at 1920 levels, and ones where you have the greenhouse gases fixed at the 1920 levels. And we can use those and compare those to get an idea why there was this global cooling, this Arctic cooling in the first half of the 20th century. Because these are typically the sort of three leading factors that are listed when you talk about what are the drivers of potential forcing that causes Arctic amplification. So what we did is look at this 20-member large ensemble from the CESM with no X-aerosol, means no aerosols, so you have your aerosols fixed, but you do your standard global warming scenario, and you get a very continuous global warming signal together with a very continuous Arctic amplification signal. Now you can do the same looking at a no greenhouse gas ensemble, meaning you only have the aerosol changes represented, but not the greenhouse gas changes. And so the aerosols, you realize, have a net cooling effect. And so again, you have continuous net cooling in the globe, but as expected, when you have cooling, you have actively amplified cooling. And so what happened was that over the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, you had the aerosol effect dominate, especially because the aerosols were mostly emitted in the northern hemisphere, in the industrialized world, and then as the aerosols decreased, at some point the greenhouse gases took over. So in order to sort of parse out the relative importance, we have here, this is the 50-year trend that I showed you the first time, right, on my first slide. So we have minus 0.15 degrees per decade in the Arctic. And from the aerosol run, that would give you minus roughly 0.22, and that is largely balanced by the greenhouse gas effect, and the residual between those two is what we would attribute to internal variability. Now the simulated internal variability in CESM is depicted by this graph. So that means basically that the residual falls nicely within that spread. Yeah, so yeah. Then looking at the globe, we have a smaller global warming signal. The aerosols and the greenhouse gases in the global picture perfectly cancel, actually, coincidentally, for this 50-year trend. And so it appears that the global signal here was mostly that it's a warming, that the fact that it was a warming signal is mostly due to internal variability, which is actually sort of kind of on the edge of what the internal variability of it. Yes?
So does global mean everything except the Arctic, or does it mean
including the Arctic?
Is there any value to separating the Arctic, pulling it out of the global signal?
It's a good question. I don't think it would change the story much.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes?
What does it mean to have the temperature of pulls out of the internal variability of the model? So the orange one exceeds the
yeah, that this is sort of, it means that our observed global warming over that 50-year period was kind of an extreme, like the internal variability conspired as much as it can to give us that global warming signal, essentially. Yeah, next.
So the observed is from those observational data sets you showed, and then to the right of the dotted line, those are all CESM?
Exactly. Yeah, and this is really just the residual of those two, right? Yes?
Sorry, you're right. You told us that in the Arctic there was a stronger warming than elsewhere on the globe, except in a curious way the other way around. But anyway. Well, it reminds me of what I found out more than 30 years ago, that the ocean water surplus from the Pacific is carried into the South Atlantic, and then it crosses the equator and flows further to the north.
Okay.
And so to extend that warming, it will be around the contribution for the warming of the Arctic. And I find it very interesting to have precisely in those epochs where warming in the Arctic was not so strong, there was more left of warming elsewhere on the north. So,
Right.
this is it.
Yeah. Thank you. So, basically, in summary, the fact that we didn't have global Arctic amplification in the first half of the 20th century was kind of an outlier. It was a specific combination of having a lot of aerosol emissions in the northern hemisphere and the greenhouse gases just starting to ramp up. Going forward, we can assume quite safely that we're in the long run, we're in it for a good bunch of more Arctic amplification. But, you know, moral of the story here is you can have factors conspiring to do that. And that was actually the case for most 50 years in the 20s. Okay, so this is in some ways a story that motivates my main, I would like to call this the prelude. And now I want to talk about one specific driver of Arctic amplification, and that is sea ice loss. And sea ice loss is sometimes regarded as the main driver of Arctic amplification. So the role of sea ice in the climate, and I've picked this picture here because it quite nicely illustrates what we sometimes think of as, or often think of as, the main impact factor from sea ice on the climate system, which is the sea ice albedo. So you can imagine there's feedbacks associated with this, right? As the sea ice retreats, you have more dark, open ocean water that absorbs more heat, which in turn drives more melt and leads to this so-called albedo feedback effect. But the sea ice has other very important implications on the climate as well. It acts as an insulator between the atmosphere and the ocean. It has impacts on the freshwater cycle, on stratification by taking up brine and rejecting brine when it grows. It insulates also the momentum, not just thermodynamic insulation, but also it suppresses wave action in the Arctic Ocean. There's impacts on surface roughness and more exotic ideas like trapping of icebergs. Now, the sea ice is one of the most striking changes that we sort of see as an illustration of global warming, right? We have lost in September about 50% of the Arctic sea ice cover. The volume has decreased because the ice thickness has gone down, and overall that has been found to have profound implications for the global climate, not just in the Arctic, but also at lower latitudes. So there's this big question of what is the climate response to sea ice loss as such. And that is very difficult to isolate in coupled simulations. So the approach that is typically taken is that you constrain the sea ice to match some further state of sea ice while keeping everything else constant. And then the idea is, if you do that, so for example here in the Antarctic, looking at Antarctic sea ice, you take your control sea ice concentration and replace it with a future sea ice concentration that you get from a fully coupled run. And you impose this, somehow you make your sea ice fit this in your coupled model, but you don't change anything else. You keep your greenhouse gases constant, you keep your aerosols, everything remains fixed. All you do is you perturb your sea ice. And then the idea is, if you do that run, you should get a effect that just identifies the response of the climate system to the sea ice loss, and not to any other heating or other feedback effects. Now, it's a tricky thing to do. So people have used oh, before I tell you how you do it, there's been a bunch of studies using these methods and finding always kind of the similar signal, right? So you, probably mostly due to albedo feedback, you have a strong warming signal, especially at the surface, and that sort of translates all the way to the equator, but it goes down quite quickly outside of the Arctic, where you don't have CS. And that's in the zonal mean temperature. There's also been studies looking at the zonal mean zonal winds, where you get these fairly robust changes, and Mark himself published a paper last year on also changes, for example, in the precipitation in the tropics as a result of CS loss. Not only that, people have been arguing that all these studies actually underestimate the impact of sea ice loss. Yeah, so most modeling results show little connection between Arctic amplification and severe mid-latitude weather, or suggest the export of excess heating from the Arctic to lower latitudes. Whereas observations seem to suggest there is a stronger impact in the modeling results. Another study by Overland suggested that relative to natural atmospheric variability, sea ice loss alone has played a secondary role in Arctic mid-latitude weather linkages and should be revisited. The story that I'm going to tell you is the opposite. We think that the impact of sea ice loss has actually been overestimated. And this is the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to try and lay this out for you. So, how do you do that? How to impose ice loss in a coupled system? Yeah? The sea ice is a very integrated part of your coupled climate model run. You can't just take it out, right? It'll ruin any simulation. So you have to be a little careful, a little innovative. So there's three main methods that people use. The first one is so-called ghost flux. You just add additional flux to the sea ice module that is unseen by other components. And you match that flux so as to give you the sea ice result that you want in the end. Yeah? So you have to do some sensitivity analysis of like how much flux do you need to get that result in the end. But ultimately, you can match the targeted sea ice loss pretty well with these ghost flux methods. Another one is, and so this one is constant. You have like a climatology of ghost flux and you just apply it every year to your sea ice. And so you match that sea ice loss that you're looking for. The nudging method is a little more conceptually, well, I don't know whether it's more challenging. You basically just take out the sea ice that you don't like at every time step. You remove a little bit of sea ice. There's different ways of doing that. You can either do a heat flux nudging, where you just add just the right amount of heat flux to melt your ice, or you literally just remove the ice. If you literally remove the ice, you're not conserving fresh water, but so be it. But ultimately, this is a group, they are all quite similar, also quite commonly used. And this is actually for the Polar Amplification Model into Comparison project, PAMEP. This is the endorsed method, you should do this. And the third one is albedo reduction, where you say, hey, we're not going to do any like artificial heat flux additions or removing of sea ice. We're just going to make the sea ice a little darker than it actually is. And as a result, we are going to lose some of that sea ice. Also, so there, you can see this is like, there's been a lot of work on this topic. Yes?
I don't quite understand the difference in the first two. How do the first two differ? What is the main approach?
So the first one, you calculate a climatology of ghost flux that's fixed. And you do sensitivity runs where you look at, if you use that ghost flux, does that end up in your, with your targeted sea ice loss? With the nudging, you at every time step, just look at where you would like your sea ice to be, and so you add a little bit of heat flux or you take a little bit of ice away. So what do these results look like? Here, Mark did this amazing work where he reached out to all the people who worked on this problem and got their data from the simulations that they did, which in itself is a Herculean task. So here, the black line is your control CI simulation. The gray dash, the gray shaded area is where you want to get to. Yeah, at the bottom here, this is your targeted CI's loss over the course of a year. The green line here is a CCSM forerun where you apply the ghost flux. Ghost flux is nice because you can match that targeted CI's loss pretty well. The red line here is the albedo method. The albedo method is having a bit of an issue because if you change the albedo in the winter, it's not going to help you much because there's no sunlight. So overall, it's always really tricky to reduce the winter ice to the extent that you would like. Yeah? In the summer, if you change your albedo, you instigate a lot of CO. Nudging is tricky because those the nudging heat fluxes or ice fluxes are not reported as output from GCM runs, so we don't actually have that data. So that's why I'm only showing you the albedo and the ghost flux. But nudging will give you something very similar. Now, if we look at the heating that is put into the system in order to achieve the CI's loss, you get this sort of pattern. The ghost flux is the one that gives you most heating typically because you just put in additional heat into the climate, into that CI's module to achieve that CI's loss. The albedo effect has a little less extra heating, quite a bit less extra heating, but you see you have all this additional heat basically going in. You'll wonder there's all these dashed and dotted lines. Those are additional runs that we didn't put on here. So the different dashed red lines are different albedo runs from different studies. There's another ghost flux from another study as well. Now, this heating then translates into a warming. So as a result, you will have surface warming that to a certain degree because of diffusion or transport of heat away from the Arctic region is felt all throughout the globe. Any questions so far? Okay, so there are advantages and issues associated with all these methods. I should also say these are just the three main methods. People have used others, but these are sort of the ones that are most commonly used. So the ghost flux has the advantage of giving you a good targeted CI's loss, but the energy is not conserved, right? You're actually putting energy into the system, and you're doing that directly. Well, you might argue you only put it into the CI's module, but obviously you will feel that in your coupled system. The nudging kind of has an energy conserved, and it matches the targeted CI's loss exactly, but it does have indirect heating because you are injecting latent heat if you remove CI's from your system. Yeah? You can't take the CI's out without having some heat input. And the albedo reduction has this difficulty to match the seasonal cycle. And even though you're not actively putting heat in, you're reducing your albedo, so you are increasing solar absorption. So you are actually also putting heat, net heat into the system. So all of these add extra heat to melt the ice. And the thing is that this leads to spurious warming. Because there's like a nuanced misunderstanding. I think it's associated with this idea that sea ice keeps the surface temperature at freezing or below, so that people think if I just remove some sea ice, I'm not actually causing any warming. And from a planetary perspective, the heat in has to equal the energy out. And energy out is outgoing long-wave radiation, which is a function of temperature. And so in order to achieve planetary energy balance, you will need a temperature perturbation to balance this. And so when you do any of these model runs, you will conflate the effect of sea ice loss with the effect of that additional heating that you're putting in. And fortunately, I have a model and I have a tool to show you why and how that is the case. Because this is all a little hand wavy, and you can't isolate those two in coupled runs. There's no straightforward to get to separate because of all the nonlinear effects. So, how do we isolate warming due to ice loss? Well, it's difficult in comprehensive climate simulations, but doable using an idealized climate model. And I will tell you about this climate model. And if you have taken my class, then you are aware of this model, and you can snooze off for the next 5 minutes. So, we are looking at a 1D diffusive energy balance model, very sort of textbooky, Bodico-Sellers style. You have solar radiation coming in, balanced by outgoing long-wave radiation, and heat transport from the equator to the pole that is represented, and I apologize to all the atmosphericists here, represented as a simple diffusive process that sort of accounts for all atmosphere and ocean heat flux, just general heat flux as a diffusive process with a constant diffusivity. Sorry, I don't know why that popped up independently. So this is a model that Ian and I developed in 2015 when I was a postdoc at Scripps with Ian. And what I did, what is new compared to the standard EBM, is that I took a single column sea ice model with sea ice thermodynamics and put it in at every grid box of your energy balance model. So now I'm coupling the seasonal cycle, which is a function of time of sea ice, with this spatially varying energy balance model. So this is sort of like just one step more complicated than your standard diffusive energy balance model, but it gives you an idea of what the sea ice is doing. What's nice about this model is that you can describe the state of your surface with one single variable, and that is the enthalpy that is either sea ice thickness, H is your sea ice thickness when your enthalpy is negative, or the temperature of your surface mixed layer when the enthalpy is positive. So you can describe your full entire climate system with one partial differential equation. Your enthalpy changes over time as a balance of albedo, or in this case co-albedo times solar input, minus outgoing long-wave radiation. I think I have to put it up here. Plus the heat transport, that's just the Laplacian of the surface temperature times diffusivity. Some ocean heat that we approximate as a constant, which is a very rough approximation, but it doesn't really impact the balance at the top that we're most interested in. And then you can add a climate forcing, F, which basically represents adding CO2 to your system. So you have three regimes of temperature. Either open water, which is just described by the melting point temperature plus the enthalpy divided by the heat capacity of the surface mixed layer. A melting ice, which is fixed at the melting point, or freezing ice, which is colder than the melting point. And this freezing ice you can calculate as the balance of fluxes at the surface. So you have an ice, sorry, can you all see this? A little low down here. You have an ice heat flux equation, which is basically the heat that diffuses through the ice has to be balanced by the surface heat fluxes. And what's really nice about this model, that's not the case in a coupled climate model, is that the energy fluxes at the surface depend linearly on the surface temperature. And that means that your annual mean surface temperature does not actually depend on ice thermodynamics. And I can show you why that is the case. This is the last slide of equations, and then we can all breathe again. This is when I take the annual mean. So, sorry, I realized I replaced the melting temperature with the freezing temperature here. That's a little gauche, but it's, I meant to change this to M. Yeah, this is temperature. But in most real-world scenarios, they are the same, right? And so, in the annual mean, I don't have the dEdt anymore, right? This is the annual mean of my steady state system. Now, I can decompose the delta Ts so I run my control run, and then I put some delta F forcing in it, and then if I look at the difference between those two, I have an annual mean temperature difference in the surface that is the northern hemisphere mean plus some latitudinal structure. And the nice thing is that the northern hemisphere mean actually just reduces to your change in the forcing and your change in the annual mean albedo. All the CIS thermodynamics drops out. Okay, and the same thing kind of happens with the meridional structure of your global warming signal. There's only a dependence on the change in surface albedo in the system. So you have a system that only reacts to changes in surface albedo. So obviously, this is super idealized. I'm ignoring lapse rate feedbacks and ocean circulation changes, etc. But the nice thing of this situation is that I can isolate the changes due to sea ice loss, which are just the ones due to the change in the albedo. That's the only impact of the sea ice loss on my global climate. And then the warming due to my climate forcing is this delta F. And I can isolate those two, okay? So, I'm running 3 experiments. The first one is a control experiment where I don't have any climate forcing and I keep my surface albedo as it should be. Second one is my future experiment. This is sort of the total warming experiment where I increase F by 3.1 watts per meter squared, and I get the corresponding future sea ice state. And then we do a specified albedo run where we don't have the forcing. Like this is sort of our simulation compared to what all the others do. But in our case, I can actually specify the future albedo and look at what just the specified albedo does to the climate system. And that is different than the albedo nudging system because here I don't have a feedback here, right? This is just specified future albedo. So this gives me my total warming. The difference between those two gives me the warming without sea ice changes because I'm keeping delta alpha S fixed. And then I have, if I compare the control to the specified albedo and don't have a climate forcing, that gives me the warming from the sea ice loss itself. Okay? So in this linear model, I can actually tell you exactly what the sea ice loss does to the climate versus what the climate forcing does. Which is very different to a coupled system where the two are conflated. And if you look at the case where, so this, I've blanked out the change in delta AS, alpha S now, and so this is the difference between the control and the future run. Sorry, this is the difference between the future and the specified albedo run, right? Because I don't have that delta S component. I just have the delta F over B, and delta F is a constant, and so is the B, and I can tell you that the global warming, just from the forced climate run, is 1.48 Kelvin. And it doesn't even have a meridional structure. Yeah? So the impact in this very linear system is just, if I put 3 watts per meter squared in, I warm my entire northern hemisphere by 1.5 Kelvin. So now I can also reproduce these 3 methods that we had in the coupled models. I can do the same in my idealized model and see how much warming that's going to give. Yeah, so I can put ghost flux, in our case 60 watts per meter squared, and just add that wherever there's sea ice, and it actually results in us getting exactly the right amount of sea ice loss. Because we checked what we need to add, and that's the amount we need to add. We can also nudge, where we just remove sea ice to match those future conditions. And we can reduce the albedo, and there's a bit of a nuance here, right? Because I was telling you, you can either match the annual mean albedo or you can match the summer albedo. You can't match both. So we did both of those simulations. So our model, it's super idealized, and we have a bit of an issue because it's kind of an aquaplanet, right? There's no landmass, so the lines look a little different, but pretty similar, right? These magnitudes are actually quite similar to what I showed you for the fully coupled runs. So this is our control simulation. This is our targeted loss, the gray shading. And the 3 different lines are the 3 different ways to remove sea ice as you would do it in a coupled simulation. And so we can compute directly. We know exactly how much added heat flux we put into the system here. And if you compare it to that picture that I showed you earlier, it's kind of similar, right? I mean, considering the degree of idealization of my climate model, I think we can be pretty happy in how we match those 2, right? The nudging occurs mostly where the winter ice edge is, whereas the albedo change occurs mostly where the summer ice edge is, and we don't have the nudging right for the fully coupled runs. But if you compare the red and green to those red and green, they're not that bad. So let's see, what does the surface temperature response in the EVM actually look at? So this is my total warming run. I get about 2 degree Kelvin at the equator, and roughly twice that at the pole. And so this is my full response to 3 degrees of radiative impact. If I do the run with the specified albedo and no climate forcing, this is the result. So this is my idealized climate model's reaction to removing the sea ice. As I told you, the difference between the sea ice run and the total climate run is a constant. It is that 1.5 Kelvin. That's just delta F over B. So now the money question is, if I do the ghost flux, the nudging, the albedo runs, if they do the right thing, i.e. identify the sea ice loss impact alone, they should match up with the graded iron. If they don't, if they overestimate that, then they conflate impacts from that spuriously added heating with the impacts from the sea ice loss alone. And so here it is, and lo and behold, I wouldn't have built this all up so much, right, if they had matched perfectly. What you can see is that all of these impacts are way too large in the Arctic, and that actually translates all the way to the pole. Even for the albedo where we just matched the summer sea ice, which basically means we didn't remove nearly enough sea ice compared to our target, and we still overestimate the impact of the sea ice loss. all these methods in our idealized climate model overestimate the warming due to sea ice loss. Because you are adding heat to the system in order to remove the ice. Either ghost flux nudging or changing the surface albedo. Now, people have acknowledged that ghost flux doesn't conserve the temperature, the energy, but the assumption is always sort of implicitly like any spurious additional heating is probably small. In our idealized model, which matches everything else pretty well, this is not a small signal. Yeah? Overall, this is the overestimation factor. So the albedo overestimates Arctic warming by 60%, tropical warming by 40%. The ghost flux method in our runs has double the warming than you would get. So the big question now is that going to bear out in the global climate models? And that's the question that I cannot answer. So, just in summary, to conclude here. We use an idealized model that can isolate the warming due to sea ice loss from the warming that's due to the heat required to remove the ice. We can implement the three standard methods that are used in the global climate runs and find that they overestimate the warming attributed to sea ice loss. So the warming from the sea ice is in these runs conflated with the warming due to spurious artificial radiative forcing. And that means, in contrast to what a lot of these other studies are claiming, and there are most likely impacts that are underestimated in the climate models, but there is a significant conceptual misunderstanding, in our opinion, that leads to overestimation of the impact of sea ice loss. Yeah, and that's somewhat in contrast to current debate. And with that, I would like to thank you with one more pretty picture.
Excellent. Got some lights, we can see the audience a bit more, but ask questions, prefer if we can get students first, but...
Yes.
Your last conclusion point, I just want to conceptually understand a little bit. That is saying that when you try to isolate sea ice loss from other factors, it's overestimated. Not necessarily that something like a RCP 8.5 run or something like that might be wrong because of internal sea ice dynamics that are incorrect or something, right?
Right, absolutely. So all we're saying is that these very specific methods that people have, these kind of artificial simulations that people have come up with to remove the sea ice in a coupled run, that they are kind of double counting the heating. Because you have to heat them, you have to heat the system to melt the ice, and that heating in itself, that is not the same as an impact of sea ice loss, right? That is additional heating that you put in.
John?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just, a little bit confused. So I understand the artificial radiative forcing for the ghost flux and nudging methods, but I'm still not understanding how the albedo method introduces heat artificially.
Yeah,
Isn't
so
that essentially what you're doing as well? Yeah.
So it's not as artificial as the others, but what you are doing is absorbing more solar radiation than you would with a whiter ice, right? You're making your ice darker, which leads to somewhat unrealistic absorption of that solar radiation. And that will have a heating, that additional, somewhat spurious, somewhat unphysical absorption will have in turn a heating effect on the climate. Is that?
Okay, so in other words, the artificially reduced albedo Well, I guess my point of confusion is that if we actually are losing sea ice, then we are losing albedo.
Yes,
So
that
I'm
is
just a little
different.
bit-
So we're not,
right.
so basically they're saying, hey, let's paint the sea ice that we have a little gray, right? Or like a little brown or whatever, right? Like let's make that artificially. It's not like the same as losing sea ice in a natural climate model simulation where the sea ice goes away, right? They're saying, hey, let's have a non-climate warming simulation, right? We're not changing the greenhouse gases, we're not losing sea ice, it's our standard sort of steady state climate, and we're just making the sea ice a little darker, we're pretending ice is a little darker than it actually is.
Okay, so just artificially reducing albedo.
Exactly.
It's not
And
quite
as a
realistic.
result, you have extra heat from that artificial
Sure.
change in the albedo, and that extra heat must warm the climate somehow, right? And so that climate warming then is lumped in with the impact of the sea ice loss.
Okay,
And it's very difficult in the coupled models to separate those two.
right, thank you.
A bunch of questions, I'll let you
Yeah.
go.
Yes.
For your idealized model, if you could go back to the curve that you draw, the two parallel curves,
Mm-hmm.
is the shadow one, the one with gray, purple, is that, would you say it's the lower limit for what actually is happening, or does the temperature change when you integrate from the tropic to the pole have to match the area under the curve?
So this line is essentially, if you go back to my equations here, that line is this term, which is your change in surface albedo, not due to forcing, plus whatever. You know, this is kind of difficult to solve for TS. You have to solve it implicitly, right? But it's these two contributions. And the delta F plus B is that constant that you put on top, right? So in our idealized model, the nice thing is that we can say, hey, our perturbation in surface temperature globally, or in the northern hemisphere, is this northern hemispheric mean plus this deviation, this northern hemisphere structure. And that is, that ends up being that. So it's not like a lower bound or anything, it is just what, for the given CI simulation that we've calculated in our idealized model, that's exactly the response.
So if there's no extra forcing in the global model, global coupled model, it has to match this line, if it is correct.
Exactly. If your global coupled model, I mean, well, if your method that you use, like a ghost flux method, it has, in order to be correct, because in this model we can actually identify what the response is, because we only have that albedo effect, right? If you use the ghost flux or the nudging method, if it's correct, it has to match this one.
Okay.
And then there's a question of like, how incorrect is it, right? And then how incorrect is it in the climate model compared to this? And that's when it gets really difficult. And so it's a bit of a negative paper, because we're really just saying, hey, like, there's an issue with all your methodologies, but we have no idea how to fix them, right?
Right. Very good. Wonderful. Hold on,
I
take John.
appreciate your background work in decades where the Arctic warming was largest, it was less in the globe, and where the Arctic warming was not so strong, there the one in the rest of the world. I'm very much
Okay, yeah, thank you.
decades we had.
Yeah,
We
appreciate
look
it.
at this background work, but it's really
Great.
interesting.
Take John. How's that?
Yeah, excellent presentation, Phil. A clear conceptual idea and great use of the idealized model. Very interesting. I wonder if, this is probably too expensive, and maybe it doesn't even work, but what if you're adding this heat to do any of those other methods, and then you get a different global PV field, invert the PV field at every time step, pull out everything that you get from just that
fake PV and then continue your integration? Are you getting rid of the heat and all of its global consequences when you do that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. So I think the main challenge is that the relationship between the energy fluxes in the coupled model, between the energy fluxes at the surface and the temperature, that relationship is non-linear. So you can't separate those two, and you have these feedbacks that convolute the two, and I don't know enough about PV to.
No, I think it would be a cheat and it wouldn't work. But I just wanted to.
Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, it's a great idea.
Because every piece of PV that you invert has its own height and temperature perturbation. So maybe you'd be stealing some of the temperature perturbation that gets double counted. That's what I was thinking.
Right.
But I don't know if you would. You can't brush it under the rug.
Right.
Like you're saying, that's the whole essence of your talk.
Right, yeah.
And I don't think there's any particular fancy method that allows you to brush it under the rug.
Yeah,
There's just no way to do that.
Yeah.
So anyway, thanks for a great talk.
Thank you.
I think Cannon or something.
Yeah, so in all the studies that kind of do these different methods, did any of them actually give a reason for their assumption that the heating that they add to the system would be small? Like, is there a dynamical reason that they can make that, or were they just like, we don't know, so we're going to assume?
Yeah, I think somehow, and I think the assumption is somehow because you're not changing the surface temperature when you are removing that ice, especially in the nudging runs. The idea is that somehow the understanding is that you're removing the ice without changing the warming, right? Without changing the temperature.
Okay.
But there's a fallacy there because you are adding heat if you remove. You're changing the latent heat of the surface.
Right. No, I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
I think I was just wondering if anybody had actually thought about that when they were writing those papers. If anybody even felt like this might be a problem, or if this is the first time that this has sort of been brought to light at all, or
I mean, there has
thought about it but didn't know how to do it.
There has been acknowledgements from some of the ghost flux papers that yes, we are not conserving heat, and there's also we talked to Clara Besser about this, and she was basically saying, well, how big is that effect, right? If that spurious heating is only a 10% impact on the global warming, then it's maybe not that bad, right? But if it's 50%, then you're really starting to get into it.
Yeah, so for the most part, most of those studies were just kind of erring on the side of assuming that it was 10% or so.
Yeah, and I mean, the paper's in review, and we have gotten review comments where it's sort of pushing back on this idea, saying if you're just removing ice, you're not impacting the surface balance because you're having, I don't know.
Okay, no,
because the ice traps that temperature.
If somebody else in the literature has been thinking along the lines of this, or people just kind of didn't realize.
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit of this is all going to get posted online, right? I think it's a little bit of it's easy to get carried away with current model simulations.
Yes.
And so sometimes I think it's really helpful to go back to these idealized models and try and sort of pick out certain aspects and certain processes and just make sure that you sort of understand what's really happening.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's maybe some benefits in going the other direction too, right? If the question is not so much about Arctic amplification, but about sensible impacts to mid-latitude or tropical systems, wouldn't doing weather level simulations where you have different initial conditions on sea ice tell you something useful too, but in a different way? Right, if the question is Arctic amplification is causing more extreme weather.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in some regards, it's it's almost not an Arctic amplification question anymore, right? It's really more of a basic energy balance question.
I think we have time for maybe one more.
What does your interface between the atmosphere and the ice of the ocean actually look like? Is it just a simple thin plane, or are you dealing with the thickness of the ice?
Yeah, so we do resolve the thickness of the ice because that is contained in that description of the enthalpy. Yeah, so our enthalpy does have ice thickness, but only with regard to how much heat flux you have through the ice. We're not concerned with, it's a 1D model. We're not resolving anything of the dynamics of the ocean.
The reason I was asking is because thermal conductivity of ice changes a lot with temperature, and compared to solid land, for example, it can be 2 to 7 times higher than land, and so that thickness could be modifying your heat flux into what's below it, and therefore modify your overall energy balance.
Right. So so we're assuming that this is a linear heat flux through the ice, which basically assumes a large Stefan number approximation, which is satisfied for ice that's around 8 meters or thinner. For thin ice, you can assume that this is pretty much a linear gradient in the temperature. So for modern day sea ice, this is actually a fairly close and valid approximation.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Liz, you had one more?
Oh, I need one last.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you.
You know where to find him, and thank you. And